When people compare the United States and Europe, they usually ask the wrong question. The real issue is not who is safer in general, but where crime is worse, which crimes matter most, and why the numbers look so different. In this video, we'll go beyond headlines and slogans and look at the official data, crime by crime. You'll see where the US is truly more dangerous, where Europe is surprisingly worse than you might expect, and what explains those differences. Most importantly, we'll look at who actually commits these crimes and what that tells us about each side of the Atlantic. Because if you want the full picture, a simple ranking is not enough. Welcome to Amazing Europe. Let's start with the one thing nobody can argue about. On homicides, the United States is still clearly above Europe. The US homicide rate sits at around 5.0 per 100,000. The EU, in 2023, roughly 3,930 intentional homicides across 447 million people. That's about 0.9 per 100,000. The US rate is more than 5 times higher. But here's where it gets more interesting. Because US bad, Europe good is way too simple. Inside the US, the gap between states is enormous. Mississippi clocked in at 19.7 per 100,000 in 2024. New Hampshire, close to 1.0. And then there's Washington, D.C., not even a state, sitting at around 25 per 100,000. If D.C. were a state, it would be the most dangerous by a mile. The lesson: American violence isn't a national problem, it's a territorial one. Europe has its own version of this. The safest countries, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Italy, Czechia, the Netherlands, range from about 0.3 to 0.6 per 100,000, but parts of the Baltics and Eastern Europe push higher than some of the safest US states. So the real comparison isn't a continent versus a country. It's high-risk zones versus low-risk zones, wherever they happen to be. Now let's look at the profile behind those numbers. In the US, about 88% of homicide arrestees in 2019 were male, and the age profile skews very young, with late teens and 20s dominating. That tells us something important. Most homicides are not random acts by strangers or serial killers. They are usually tied to escalating conflicts, retaliation, gangs, drugs, and domestic breakdowns. Europe shows a similar male and young pattern, but it's less extreme. And, crucially, firearms play a much smaller role. Which brings us to the why. Experts don't point to one single cause. They point to a cluster: easy gun access, concentrated inequality, residential segregation, weaker social safety nets in certain areas, and a cultural environment where everyday conflict can turn lethal fast. In Europe, the same conflicts exist. They just kill people less often. Guns are harder to get. Social protection is stronger. Deprivation is less concentrated. That does not mean Europe has no violence. It means violence is less likely to escalate into homicide. And that is the real gap. Homicides were just the beginning. Now let's talk about violent crime. And the picture gets messier. In the US, violent crime sat at 359 per 100,000 in 2023. Robbery, 60.6. Aggravated assault, 256.1. And Washington, D.C., still in a category of its own. 1,005.5 violent crimes per 100,000, with 481.5 robberies alone. One city, one number that tells you everything about how extreme America's territorial gap really is. Europe looks calmer at first glance. But here's the problem. Eurostat doesn't publish a single unified violent crime basket, which already makes clean comparisons difficult. The best bridge between the two systems is robbery. In 2024, the EU recorded around 251,000 robberies, roughly 56 per 100,000, slightly below the US. But then you zoom in and the story changes fast. Spain, 130 robberies per 100,000 inhabitants. Belgium, 116, Portugal, Luxembourg, and France, about 85, all of them above the American national average. So here's the first real twist. The US is still harsher overall on violent crime, but on robbery alone, several Western European countries now look worse on paper than the US national figure. The EU countries with the lowest robbery rates are Cyprus, Estonia, Hungary, and especially Slovakia. Then comes serious assault, and this is where the data starts to become less clear. The US aggravated assault category is broad but consistently defined. In Europe, serious assault shifts meaning from one country to the next, depending on legal thresholds, police recording habits, and how willing victims are to report. Italy posts very low numbers. Belgium and France post extremely high ones. We've actually covered crime country by country in Europe in separate videos. Go watch those if you want the full picture. But when it comes to the US comparison, the numbers broadly point in one direction. Europe tends to come out safer, even in these categories, with some significant exceptions. But keep in mind, for this type of crime, we're not always comparing the exact same thing. Now, the offender profile. On both sides of the Atlantic, the demographic profile is brutally consistent. Young men, aged 18 to 39, from economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. In the United States, the burden of these violent offenses falls disproportionately on historically marginalized minority communities. In Europe, non-citizens and foreign-born populations are often overrepresented in robbery and street-level crime statistics. But correlation is not causation. These groups do not generate crime because of their origin. They are simply the ones trapped inside the breeding grounds of crime. Crime is a mathematical equation. It will always concentrate wherever you combine the exact same ingredients. Broken schools, stagnant labour markets, deep segregation, fragmented family structures, and overstretched policing. And in the US, add one more variable: guns. Firearms don't just raise injury rates. They turn a robbery into a potential homicide in seconds. That's the real divide. Not just how much violence exists, but how fast ordinary conflict becomes dangerous. America accelerates that process. Europe, with tighter gun laws, stronger social buffers, and different recording systems, slows it down. Not always, not everywhere, but enough to matter. When people compare US and European crime, they default to one image. America is violent, Europe is safe. Property crime blows that up. Start with theft. US larceny theft sits at roughly 1,147 per 100,000. Sounds high. But Luxembourg, Sweden, and Denmark record theft rates between 2,500 and 2,700, more than double. A fair warning: American larceny theft and European theft are not defined in exactly the same way, so they are not perfect equivalents. But they are close enough to reveal a meaningful pattern. And the pattern is that some of the most envied countries in the world record more theft, not less. Move to burglary. And this is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because here the FBI and Eurostat are measuring essentially the same crime. The US national average is 250.7 per 100,000. The safest American states sit below 130. The worst, like New Mexico and Washington State, push much higher. Now look at Europe. Austria 700, Sweden 601, Luxembourg 568, Denmark 519, Switzerland 514. These aren't fragile states. They're some of the wealthiest, best-governed countries on the planet. And they post burglary numbers that beat the worst American states. How? The answer is structural. Dense urban housing, high-value targets, and, critically, organised cross-border criminal networks that specifically target wealthy countries. Prosperity doesn't shield you from burglary. In some cases, it makes you the target. But enforcement matters too. Europe often lacks the same certainty of punishment as the US. And when offenders believe consequences are slow or inconsistent, burglary becomes easier to repeat and harder to deter. At the other extreme, some European countries are genuinely low. North Macedonia records just 2 per 100,000 for burglary. Lithuania, 24. Bulgaria, 46. Numbers that even the safest American states can't match. Vehicle theft is where comparison almost breaks down entirely. The US average is 319 per 100,000, with Washington, D.C. above 1,070, and states like Washington, Nevada, and Colorado well above 600. But the European figure isn't counting the same thing. It includes theft of vehicle parts, not just full vehicle theft. So direct comparison is nearly impossible. What's striking is the variation inside the EU itself. The best performers are Cyprus, Romania, Slovakia, and Bulgaria. The worst? France, Italy, Sweden, and especially Luxembourg. Add non-EU countries, and Switzerland joins the top 5 worst cases. The conclusion isn't comfortable for either side. The US is not the worst in every category. Europe is not the safe haven people assume. Some of the most celebrated European democracies record property crime rates that would genuinely shock an American audience. Safe is never one number, and it's never one continent. Now, we turn to one of the most sensitive and hardest to compare categories in the entire video: reported sexual assault. This is arguably the most deceptive category in our entire comparison. On paper, the US reported rate for these offences sits at 37 per 100,000 in 2023. Alaska hit 122. Delaware sat near 16. Wide gap, familiar pattern. But the moment you try to compare that with Europe, the ground shifts under your feet. Eurostat doesn't use a single unified definition. It splits these incidents into distinct legal baskets, from physical assault to various degrees of exploitation. This means no headline number is ever perfectly interchangeable with the American figure. Take the most severe cases of assault alone. The European map is all over the place. Poland, Bulgaria, Serbia, Slovakia, around 1 to 3 per 100,000. Sweden, 88. France, 66. Finland, 53. Denmark, 39. On paper, these Northern European numbers are far higher than the American rate. But that doesn't mean what you think it means. Several European countries, especially in the north, have moved to a consent-based legal model. No explicit consent is enough to classify an interaction as a severe offence, regardless of physical force or overt threat. That makes the legal definition broader and more victim-centred. It also makes it structurally incomparable with countries where the legal threshold is narrower. Italy or Poland look low, partly because their system captures fewer cases under the same strict label. Sweden appears higher, partly because it records cases very broadly, and because victims are more likely to report. This is what is often said, but as we showed in a dedicated video, the reality is even more complex, and the high numbers of certain crimes in countries like Sweden are not due only to the consent-based law or to the higher willingness of Swedish women to report. In any case, we can say that the most direct comparison available is this. The US reports 37 cases per 100,000, while the EU average is 22. But that gap is filtered through radically different legal frameworks, so treat it with caution. The real story here is not just the volume of crime. It is whether a country treats consent as the central legal line, or just one piece of a harder puzzle to prove. Organised crime is one of the clearest cases where the United States and Europe should not be read through the same lens. According to the Global Organised Crime Index, the United States ranks 60th out of 193 countries, with a criminality score of 5.87. Remember, the closer the score is to 10, and the closer a country is to the top of the ranking, the worse the situation is. That puts the US in a not-so-good position, but still above several major European countries. The European picture is mixed, but many countries perform worse than the United States. Beyond transcontinental cases like Russia and Turkey, countries such as France, Spain, and especially Italy score higher than the US. Several northern European countries perform significantly better. The United Kingdom is tied with the United States in terms of the presence and relevance of organised crime within its borders. In short, while the US is not a global extreme, its organised crime levels are still higher than in most of Western and Northern Europe. When you move from organised crime to drug-related crime, the comparison becomes even more revealing. In the US, drug trafficking is deeply tied to Mexican cartels, local gangs, prison networks, and money laundering structures that move through real estate, logistics, and cash-heavy businesses. In Europe, the market is increasingly dominated by transnational groups, especially cocaine and synthetic drug routes, with the Ndrangheta, Albanian networks, and Dutch-Belgian logistics hubs playing a major role. Europe is not less involved, it is simply organised differently. The key difference is that the US drug market is often more territorial and fragmented, while the European one is more networked and trade-based. That means American crime is more visibly linked to urban violence, street distribution, and prison gangs, whereas European crime is more connected to ports, container traffic, wholesale importation, and sophisticated laundering. In both cases, however, the drug trade is not a side effect of organised crime. It is one of its core revenue streams. So the real comparison is this. The US sits above many European countries in organised crime intensity, but Europe contains both much safer countries and some that are highly exposed. And in both regions, the drug economy is what turns criminal groups from local predators into durable business systems. When we talk about safety, we usually focus on violence, but there is a silent systemic decay happening across the West, the gradual collapse of low-level law enforcement. And on this front, the breakdown is happening on both sides of the Atlantic. In the United States, cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles became infamous also for California's Proposition 47, a 2014 law that made shoplifting under $950 a mere misdemeanor. Under this system, police stopped arresting petty thieves, creating a cycle of catch and release and virtual impunity. Retailers locked up basic goods, stores closed, and street-level order eroded. However, after heavy protests, Proposition 36 was enacted in 2024, aiming to limit the damage of the previous reform. But the American landscape is highly diversified. While California struggled, states like Texas and Florida took a radically different path. In these territories, property crime is met with aggressive policing, strict sentencing, and immediate jail time. In these states, the deterrence is real, so the United States is very diverse from this point of view. In Europe, however, this certainty of punishment is rarely felt. For years, Spain operated under a similar legal loophole where any theft under €400 was classified as a minor offence, carrying only a small fine. Professional pickpockets exploited this daily in Barcelona, knowing they would never face jail. Just like in California, Spain recently had to change its previous reform. The UK fell into the exact same trap. Under the 2014 Crime and Policing Act, shoplifting under £200 was downgraded, triggering a massive nationwide retail theft epidemic before the government was forced to intervene. Yet, despite these recent legal rollbacks, the structural damage is already done. In many European cities, the streets still feel increasingly unsafe when it comes to petty theft. Why? Because passing a law is useless without the certainty of punishment and a real, visible police presence. Today, European police forces are often understaffed and slow to react, and in many countries, also underpaid. Without immediate certain consequences for criminals, the culture of petty theft remains highly profitable. It is a policy choice. When governments decide that protecting private property is no longer a priority, they simply shift the bill to the middle class, in the form of higher prices, closed businesses, and the slow, visible decay of public order. Before we move to the final part of this video, if you're finding this analysis valuable, please support our project. Take a second to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our documentaries. And since we touched on migration, if you want us to rank all European countries by their percentage of immigrants, type Europe in the comments below. So, who wins this transatlantic face-off? When we look at the raw numbers, the final verdict is not a simple ranking. It is a lesson in geography, policy, and human behaviour. But to truly understand this data, we must first make one crucial thing clear. When we compare the United States to Europe, we must remember that we are comparing a single country to an entire continent. The United States, despite its vast size and deep regional divides, operates under a single federal roof. It shares a constitution, a Supreme Court, a federal baseline for law enforcement, and a single language. Yes, California, Texas, and Florida take radically different approaches to policing and punishment, but they still exist within the same national structure. Europe is not a country. It is a highly fragmented mosaic of fully sovereign nations, each with its own legal framework, police force, and history. And if we look beyond the wealthy borders of the European Union, across the entire European continent, these internal divides turn from gaps into absolute chasms. Comparing the institutional safety of Switzerland or Italy, where homicide rates are microscopic, to the high-risk zones of Eastern Europe, the Baltics, or the Balkans, is fundamentally misleading. So, where are you actually safer? The answer depends entirely on what you are trying to protect. If you want to protect your life from lethal violence, Europe's tight gun laws and stronger social safety nets make it structurally superior. The US homicide rate remains a tragic national anomaly, driven by localized territorial violence. But if you want to protect your wallet and your property from theft and burglary, the European lack of police presence and certainty of punishment has created massive pockets of vulnerability. In many Western European hubs, the threat of property crime is far higher than in the safest American states. Safety is not a continental average. It is a local reality. It is determined not by the flag you fly, but by the street you walk on. Whether you are in Washington, D.C. or Munich, Mississippi or Moldova, your safety is decided by your zip code, not your continent. So, how safe is your zip code? What are your thoughts on the situation in your country and in the United States? Let's start an honest conversation in the comments below. As a reminder, if you want to see the complete ranking of European countries by immigrant percentage, just type Europe in the comments. If you want another head-to-head comparison between these two giants, we highly recommend watching this video, where we look at the only European countries that actually beat the US at retaining their brightest minds. That's all for today. See you next time.